Francisco de Cuellar had been injured. He was lame and he was too slow getting back, and he missed the boat.
And he was lucky.
He was lucky because the boat went down with all hands, just in sight of the shore.
It's extraordinary.
Extraordinary.
My father turned to my grandfather, sort of beaming with pride, and he said, "Well, what you think now, Dad? I've bought this place that you used to work in." And my dad said that his father looked at him and said, "I think you need your head examined."
Allegedly, this waterhound, this fierce Daraku, this very ferocious beast or demon, comes from the depths of the lake and slays her.
You're starting to see.
Ah, right. You need to hold it to the right angle to the light.
Yeah, you can start to see now it's coming.
I can see it. I mean, when you started brushing that off, I could see nothing. now, oh, there's Luke. Yeah, I can see it now. Few historians would argue that the Annals of the Four Masters, written in the first half of the 17th century, remains one of the most important and most frequently quoted histories ever written about Ireland. Nor that Michael O'Clery was the first and the greatest of those masters. Of all the places in Europe that he could have chosen in which to write his monumental work of scholarship and safety, the small territory of the MacClancys of Dartry might seem an odd choice. Because with the O'Donnells of Donegal to the north, the Maguires of Fermanagh to the east, the O'Connors of Sligo to the south and the west, and the English in open warfare with all of them, this had been for centuries one of the most embattled places in the entire country. Yet this is where Michael O'Clery decided that he and his work would be best protected, arguing to himself perhaps that if the MacClancys could survive each other, then they could survive anything. Welcome to the village and the parish of Kinlough in the ancient land of Dartry in the north of County Leitrim. The fame of the MacClancys of Dartry, perhaps, has not spread very far beyond this beautiful place they called home. So I should explain that they were a minor clan whose tiny territory, hardly measuring 20 square miles in total, extended from the shores of Lough Melvin up to the Dartry Mountains in an almost continuous slope, and was further defined and connected to the sea by the River Drowes to the north and the Bunduff River to the south. They were obviously great survivors, the MacClancys, because they had been clinging to their watery, mountainy fastness for at least 700 years by the time Michael O'Clery settled himself here to put the finishing touches to his magnum opus in the 1630s. This was his contribution to the Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland, or the Annals of the Four Masters, as the compilation was later dubbed, which deals with the history of Ireland from about 3000 BC up to the year 1616. Michael O'Clery came from nearby Ballyshannon originally, went to Louvain in Belgium where he became a Franciscan friar, and then returned to Ireland in 1627, where he spent his time travelling the country seeking to study whatever ancient historical manuscripts had survived the turbulence of previous decades. His work completed, he left Ireland never to return in 1637, little realising that the MacClancy clan, those inveterate survivors whose protection he had sought, we think, would not survive much longer in the aftermath of the 1641 rebellion. The notion that the MacClancys may have played this role of protector is a strongly held theory of my companion Thomas Feely, who has written a comprehensive and scholarly history of the parish, the village, and the whole area we know nowadays as Kinlough, which means the head of the loch. The loch, of course, is Lough Melvin, and we're descending to its southern shore where you'll still find the remains of Rosclahar Abbey and the ivy-covered ruin of MacClancy's Crannog Castle, both abandoned since the mid-1600s. I said earlier that the often embattled MacClancys had as much to fear from each other as they had from any external enemy.
The rule of succession in the chieftains was that any member of the family, including cousins and brothers and uncles, could be the next chief, rather than the first past the post system that operated in other places.
Right.
That meant that you were in great danger if you were chief from your family.
Right.
And if you go through the annals, you find a lot of the MacClancys were murdered by their own families, who then became chiefs.
Well, the MacClancys weren't the only clan in this situation, because it was the same thing applied all over
yes,
the clan.
it did.
But they seem to have been particularly murderous.
Yeah, if you go through the annals of the Four Masters, you'll find descriptions of one MacClancy killing another MacClancy all the way through it. In fact, there's one notation in the annals where they talk about one of the MacClancys who actually died in his bed, and it seems to have been a
very unusual occurrence.
A very unusual occurrence. Yes.
Right. Now, you mentioned the Four Masters there, and you mentioned the mention of the MacClancys in the Four Masters. It would seem that with such a small tribe, hardly warranted so many mentions.
Yeah.
But that you've kind of done a bit of detective work here, and that's what convinces you that the Four Masters, or the work of Michael O'Clery, was done in the territory of the MacClancy.
You can actually find, or you can track the family from 900 to 1616 when the annals finished. But it's almost generation by generation they list the MacClancy chiefs and what they were doing and where they were killed and who killed them and so on and so forth.
And they wouldn't have done that unless they were enjoying the
Absolutely,
hospitality.
yeah, because the MacClancys in real terms were pretty minor chieftains.
Yes.
So they wouldn't have deserved the amount of mentions that are in the annals, were it not for the fact that the annals themselves were written at MacClancy's territory.
Michael O'Clery wasn't the only one to give the MacClancys an honourable mention. About 50 years earlier, another man had enjoyed their hospitality and subsequently wrote a lively and graphic account of life among the MacClancy clansfolk. He was a shipwrecked Spaniard called Francesco de Cuellar, a survivor of the disastrous Armada expedition who washed up on the shores nearby. After a series of hair-raising exploits, some of which are illustrated on the gable wall of the old courthouse, now a restaurant in Kinlough village, he ended up in MacClancy's castle, where he and another handful of Spaniards famously withstood a siege and saw off Lord Deputy Fitzwilliam and a large force of English soldiers.
The English army were rounding up the Spaniards who had been shipwrecked on the coast of Sligo. But, I mean, the place was full of corpses and Spaniards who had survived and so on. So they were rounding up the people and not treating them very well either.
No.
So they came with an army of about 1,800 to
the shores
to the other side of the lake.
Right, right.
Because this side was MacClancy's town. It was very marshy, and they didn't want to go this side, so they went the other side. As soon as MacClancy heard that they were coming, he said, "I'm for the mountain."
So he headed off towards the Dartry Mountains?
Yes, he took his people, everybody with him.
But the Spanish stayed.
But the Spanish looked at the mountain and they looked at the lake and they decided they'd stay.
This is as good a place as any.
This is as good a place as any. So they took the vessels from the church that we see here behind us, and they barricaded themselves inside the castle with their guns and so on. And it was a bit like the Alamo in many ways. You had 9 Spaniards who were facing off against 1,800 of the English army. And eventually the weather broke, it started to snow heavily, and the army decamped.
They gave it up as a bad job.
They gave it up as a bad job.
Right.
So they left anyway, and MacClancy came back, brought his people back with him, and he was so delighted with de Cuellar, he offered him his sister in marriage.
So, and that he fled after that, did he?
He thought very seriously about it, but then, yes, he heard whispers then that MacClancy was going to hold on to him come what may, and he was going to end up here. So he said to himself, I think I better go.
It's funny, I mean, I talked about the insight he gives you into the day-to-day lives, and he provides, you know, wonderfully graphic descriptions of the lifestyle of the people. And he found them, he described the men as tall and handsome and well-built, in spite of their diet, which was basically oaten bread and butter.
Yes, and they only eat 1 meal a day.
Something like that.
Yes.
And the women, he said, were very beautiful,
but
poorly dressed.
He makes special mention of MacClancy's wife, who obviously caught his eye because he said she was extremely beautiful. She must have been a real beauty at that point. Yes. And before the English army came, he spent some time with the women. He used to sit in the sun and tell their fortunes, and he had great fun.
He must have picked up a word or two of Irish.
I'd say he picked up a word or two of Irish.
Who knows what the outcome might have been had de Cuellar fancied MacClancy's sister as much as he had evidently fancied MacClancy's wife. Much the same in all probability, because from the end of the 17th century onwards, the MacClancy's former stronghold and other lands around Lough Melvin passed through the hands of a succession of landlords, the names Johnson, Dixon and White eventually becoming prominent in this area. It's an area that includes the River Drowes, which, although only 4 miles from the sea, has become one of the best known salmon fisheries in the country. And invariably, it seems, the first salmon caught each year is caught on the Drowes, where the season opens on the 1st of January. The fishery was part of the Lough estate, established by a man called Luke White in the early 1800s. It's been owned and run by the Gallagher family since 1977, and Shane Gallagher tells a satisfying story about the day his father acquired it. But first, a word about the self-made Luke White, who had arrived in Ireland from Scotland via the Isle of Man in 1782, owning nothing more than the clothes he stood up in.
And he hadn't a penny? I hadn't a penny when he arrived in Dublin, and he started selling second-hand newspapers. That was his first means of making money. Yeah. So eventually he branched out into selling second-hand books. And then he made quite a bit of money at that, and then he started up his own lottery. Right. Long before the National Lottery or scratch cards were available. Right. And at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, he was able to loan the British government money at high interest rates to fight Napoleon, and he made a fortune. So he became fabulously wealthy. He bought a very impressive stately pile in Dublin called now Luttrell Sound Castle. Right. And he was interested in acquiring sporting rights throughout the country, and he visited this area and he bought some fishing rights on Lough Melvin and the River Drowes and acquired in all about 26,000 acres in North Leitrim. 26,000 acres. He did all right for a man who started off with nothing. Not too bad, telling you. Anyway, your family took over here one generation back, or was your father? My father bought here in 1977, so just 40 years now this September. But my grandfather was orphaned quite young, and he used to work here when he was a boy. He came to work here, I think, at the age of 8 or 9. You know? Your grandfather? My father's father, yeah. My family lived on the banks of the river for generations. So my grandfather then started up a sawmill in what was a corn mill and a flax mill before that. Right. So the mill wheel was there and everything, so he reconfigured it to saw timber. Right. So my father then took over that business. Just maybe a couple of years before this place he bought here, he became allergic to the sawdust itself. He had quite severe asthma, and the dust irritated this, so he decided he was going to have to get out of that business. And it's just so happened then that this came on the market, and he acquired that 40 years ago. Can I ask you, was your grandfather still alive? My grandfather was still alive, yeah. That must have been a sort of enormous satisfaction to him. You know, I used to work as a wee kid here. Yeah. Well, I asked my dad about that actually, and he said that just after they bought the place, they drove up through the main gates, and before that they always had to use a side gate. So my father turned to my grandfather, sort of beaming with pride, and he said, "Well, what you think now, Dad? I've bought this place that you used to work in." And my dad said that his father looked at him and said, "I think you need your head examined." So he didn't think it was a good idea. He didn't think it was a good idea back in the 70s. I think the interest rates were something like 25%, and there was, of course, there's a lot of difficulties. There wasn't many tourists in the area, but with a lot of hard work between my mother and father, they made a success of the place.
Didn't they just? And while the River Drowes and Lough Melvin might be famous for their monster fish, there is another lough in the vicinity that's famous, well, just for its monsters. What lurks in the depths of Glenade when we come back. If you take the road out of Kinlough towards Manor Hamilton, following the line of the Dartry Mountains, you'll soon encounter one of the most beautifully sited graveyards in the country. It contains the grave of a woman by the name of Grace McLaughlin, née Connolly, who died in 1722. And if the story you're about to hear is true, then Grace, I'm afraid, met a gruesome end. The events of that story occurred in another beautiful location, which you'll find further out the road on the shores of Glenade Lough. It's a suitably primeval setting for the story that Regina Fahy is about to tell concerning Grace Connolly and the Daraku. Daraku is the Irish word for an otter, but the literal translation, for once appropriate perhaps, is Hound of the Deep. So her name is Grace Connolly.
Grace
The year
Connolly,
is 1722.
1722, 24th of September 1722. We are told that that's the date that all of these very, I suppose, exciting or thrilling or maybe frightening events took place. Down here on the lake shore. She leaves her home and she comes to the lake shore either to bathe or to wash clothes.
Right.
And while she's at the lake shore, allegedly this water hound, this fierce Daraku, this very ferocious beast or demon, comes from the depths of the lake and slays her on the edge of the lake. Her husband returns to their cottage, which is further down the lake, finds her absent and goes in search of her. So he makes his way to the lake shore where he finds his wife either dying or dead, and this great hideous beast lying alongside her. He goes back to his house, he arms himself with his dagger, contacts his brother arms himself as well. They get their horses and they ride back to the scene of the carnage. Battle ensues between the two men and the Daraku.
Right.
The Daraku is fatally wounded, but as it is dying, it emits a very piercing, chilling shriek.
Right.
That calls its mate from the bed of the lake.
Oh, there's two of them.
So there's a second one.
Right.
So the second Daraku emerges from the lake and chases the two men on horseback. So quite a long pursuit follows. We're told it was 20 miles in length. They make their way down the valley of Glenade. They go left across by Ballintrillick, if you can imagine, under Ben Wiskin and right round to Ben Bulben. And one of the horses loses a shoe and they stop at the blacksmith. The blacksmith shoes the horse again for them and they obviously tell him the story. The beast obviously hasn't caught up with them at this stage.
Right.
So he gives MacLachlan a long iron sword and he tells him what to do in the eventuality of the beast catching up with them. And he points him in the direction of a fort, which really nestles under the brow there of Ben Bulben's head. And they go to the stone fort and on the blacksmith's advice, they place the two horses lengthways at the entrance to the fort. And the blacksmith had said that when the creature catches up with you, it will plunge its way through the horse. Its head will emerge on the other side, and when it does, then you decapitate it. You chop it off.
Right.
So apparently, according to the story, this is exactly what happened. The beast catches up with them, plunges through the horse, and MacLachlan slays it with the iron sword given him by the blacksmith.
It's an extraordinary story all the same, isn't it? And there's elements of truth and reality about this because she did exist.
She did exist.
She's buried in the graveyard.
She did
nearby.
exist, and she is. That's what turns it from a fable or a myth into something a little bit more real.
Yeah.
But the gravestone itself turns it into something a little bit more real again.
Right.
The date of the event is on the gravestone, the 24th of September 1722. But what's most, I suppose, intriguing about the gravestone is that at the top of the gravestone there is a carving, and a very distinctive carving, of a beast that's crouching. Now it looks like a huge dog,
Right.
and you can see it's sort of lying on its haunches. The paws are quite distinct, the head is quite distinct, and from the neck is protruding what appears to be a dagger.
If others could tell that story with the same skillful weave of myth and realism that Regina brings to it, then it's only a matter of time before the Daraku of Glenade Loch becomes as famous as the Loch Ness Monster. Back to the safety of the village again for my last port of call. And one of the reasons that Dubliner Michael Condren settled in Kinlough, besides wedding a local woman of course, is that here he has a mountain at the end of his street. He also has a shed in his back garden where he can indulge a passion that seems to combine all his talents and interests. Craftwork, IT, engineering and a wide range of music, including that produced by his son's band Rollin' Empire, hence the t-shirt. Michael makes these wood engravings, but the process isn't simply hands-on. It begins on the computer indoors. So you're emphasising the wee curly hairs here and there, and you're intensifying. You know, you're making it more contrasty. Would that be fair enough?
That'd be correct.
So you're bringing out some things that are going to be brighter,
and
other things are going to
be darker, and that's what it'll give you the image. It's very important to try and get the eyes correct if you can, because the one thing you don't want is you don't want two holes in a burnt blanket, because that's really what'll happen.
That's what happened. Well, in Luke's case, of course, you hardly ever saw his eyes because they had them squeezed shut and concentration.
His concentration was unbelievable. Yeah. But
he's a bit like myself in that regard.
Yeah.
But he could sing.
He could sing. It's just an amazing photograph.
Yeah. Well, that amazing photograph, after Michael's computer prep, is fed into the brain of this router out in the shed, which Michael has already programmed.
Sorry if there's going to be a little bit of dust, but it's just to give you an idea.
There should be an emerging picture of some sort here, should there be?
Now you're starting to see.
Ah, right. You need to hold it to the right angle to the light.
Yeah, you can start to see now it's coming.
I can see it. I mean, when you started brushing that off, I could see nothing. now, oh, there's look. You need a bit of artistic flair and an imagination and a bit of ability with your hands. You need to understand how the computer works in a whole lot of different ways, and you need this basic engineering.
You do. You need a basic engineering knowledge as well, because of the machinery that you're using. You're using saws, you're using drills, you're using routers, sanders, planers. There's quite a bit of kit involved in it.
So you do this as kind of, as a pastime more than anything else.
It is. Some people call it, isn't it nice to have a hobby? It's more than a hobby.
More than that.
It's a passion. Right. I just love doing it, and as well as that, it gets me out of the shed.
But it's not the kind of hobby that anybody could just pick up. Well, they maybe could teach themselves eventually.
No,
but you had certain skill set that you started off with.
I started off with a basic engineering skill set, which helped me to understand measurements and controls, and then I had some IT skills, and that certainly helps. The rest you learn, and it takes 3 to 4 years to learn. It really does. Look, it's like everything else. Every day you're learning something. So, and that all helps, and you just hope you don't forget it as you go along.